The third week of October, the morning the betrothal was to be announced. A single jeweled comb lay missing from Lady Marise Theowood's dressing table, and the whole of the great house at Theowood Court had turned cold, with the knowledge that someone would be blamed for it before noon. Mercy Fenwick knelt at the cold grate in her mistress's chamber, and did not look up. She had built that fire before the sun, as she did every morning, and she knew the room the way she knew her own hands, which floorboards sighed underfoot, which drawer in the rosewood table stuck in damp weather. She knew, too, that the comb had not been stolen. She had seen it slide from the table the evening before, when Lady Marise had wept against her own reflection, and swept her arm across the glass, and Mercy had gathered the comb from the carpet and set it in the lacquered box where such small treasures lived. Then the box had been opened in the night, by a hand that was not hers, and the comb was gone, and a thing taken in the dark is never blamed on the one who took it. Below the stairs the bell-board jangled. Above it, in the long gallery where the family's faces hung in gold frames going back 100 years, a man stood at a tall window with his back to the room, and he was thinking, though no one could have known it from the stillness of him, that he would rather have faced a French battery than the morning before him. That was the morning everything turned. It began, though, as these things do, much earlier, and quieter, and with no comb at all. Mercy had come to Theowood Court 3 years before. In the spring, she turned 20, with 1 box of mending, and a reference from a vicar's widow, and nothing else in the world. She was not a beauty by the season's reckoning, and the season's reckoning was the only one that mattered in the great houses. She was of middling height, with chestnut hair she kept bound close and plain, hazel eyes quick to notice and slow to give anything away, and a scattering of freckles across her nose that no amount of buttermilk would persuade to fade. Her hands were clever. That was the whole of her fortune. She could mend a torn flounce, so the tear could not be found again. Take a gown 3 years out of fashion and turn it new. Dress, hair, keep a lady's secrets, and a lady in a great house has more secrets than gowns. To the household, she was just the new girl from the country. And then, when she was no longer new, she was just Fenwick, the one who sat up late with the candle and the needle. To the upper servants she was useful. To Lady Marise, in time, she became something the daughter of a duke is not supposed to have, which is a friend, though neither of them would ever have spoken the word aloud, for the speaking of it would only have made the distance hurt. Lady Marise Theowood was 20 years old that autumn, the only surviving child of the Duke of Theowood, and she was lovely in the way the gold frames in the gallery were lovely, which is to say, she had been arranged. She played the pianoforte beautifully, and walked into a room as though it had been waiting for her, and all of it had been built into her by governesses and her late mother's relentless ambition, and underneath it she was frightened nearly all the time. Mercy knew this because Mercy dressed her in the mornings, and a woman who dresses another woman learns where the fear lives in the body. It lived, in Lady Marise, at the base of her throat. In a small fluttering pulse Mercy could see when she fastened the high collars, and it beat fastest when the subject of her marriage was raised. For Lady Marise was to be married. The whole county knew it before she did. The Duke had debts the size of the house itself, debts that never appeared in any conversation, but governed every conversation, and a daughter was the one coin a duke could spend without anyone calling it spending. And so a match had been made, the way matches are made between 2 families and 2 purses and 2 ancient names, and the man on the other side of it was the Earl of Northmere. Thaddeus Cardew, the Earl of Northmere, was 34 that year, and he was spoken of in the drawing-rooms in the lowered voice reserved for men whose grief has made them frightening. He was tall and built like something quarried broad through the shoulder, with dark hair going early to gray at the temple, gray blue eyes set deep, a hard clean line of jaw, and a mouth that had forgotten the habit of smiling. There was a thin, pale scar through his left eyebrow, an old thing, a riding fall in his boyhood, and it gave him a permanent look of faint skepticism, as though he doubted the world and found it wanting. The drawing-room said he was cold. They are not often wrong about a man's surface, and almost never right about what lies under it. He had been engaged once, before. 10 years gone. To a girl he had loved without the smallest reservation, and she had died in 3 days of a fever that came up out of nowhere in the wet end of a winter. And he had sat by her and held her hand and watched the physician do nothing and learn that there are walls a man cannot defend, whatever his rank or his love. After that he had folded himself up. He had managed his lands and refused every match his grandmother proposed year upon year, until the family's needs and pride and its iron-willed dowager had at last worn him down to a single grim agreement. He would marry. He would do his duty and take the Duke of Theawood's beautiful, frightened daughter, restore both houses with the union, and he would feel nothing, because feeling nothing was the only safety he had left. That was the man who came to Theawood Court 3 weeks before the betrothal was to be announced, to walk the grounds with his intended bride and let the county see the thing was settled. Mercy first saw him on a gray afternoon in the last week of September, from the window of the linen room, where she was turning sheets. He came up the long drive on a black horse, alone, ahead of his carriage, and he sat it the way some men wear an old coat, without thought, and he did not look up at the house with the calculation or envy of other visitors. He looked at it the way a man looks at a debt. Mercy watched him dismount and hand the reins to a groom without a word, and stand a moment in the thin light with his hat in his hand, and she saw before she had any business seeing it that he did not want to be there at all. It was in the set of his shoulders, which said only one thing, that he wished it done quickly. She thought no more of him than that. He was the Earl, she was the girl with the needle, and their lives ran in channels that did not touch, and she had no wish for them to touch. For a maid who lifts her eyes to a great man is a maid who ends in ruin, and Mercy Fenwick had not survived 3 years and a hard girlhood by being a fool. Yet the house is small for those who serve it, and large only for those who are served. And in the days that followed, she could not help but cross his path. She brought a wrap to the terrace, and he was there. She carried mending past the library door, and it stood open. And he was within, alone, a book unopened on his knee, looking at the fire. Once, in the cold blue hour before anyone else was waking, she came down to fetch water, and found him already in the breakfast room, fully dressed, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the mist lift off the park. And he turned at the small sound of her, and for one unguarded moment before he composed his face, she saw what was in it, and it was the loneliest thing she had ever looked upon. She curtsied and went to withdraw. His voice stopped her. "You are her woman," he said. "Fenwick." That he knew her name surprised her. Servants were furniture to such men. "Yes, my lord." He looked at her a moment longer, and she felt the look the way one feels a draught from a door one had thought shut. Then he turned back to the window. "She does not sleep," he said. "Lady Maurice. I have seen the candle under her door past 2 in the morning. I am told. You sit up with her. I sit up with my work, my lord." "Do not let her grow ill over this," he said, and the words were level and quiet, and could have been a command from a master about a horse, except that they were not, and they both knew it. "Whatever I am to her, I would not have her made ill by it." He had not looked at her as he said it, and Mercy understood, standing there with the empty pitcher in her hands, that this cold man had noticed something no one else in the house had troubled to notice, which was that the bride was breaking quietly where no one of consequence could see. He had said it to the maid because the maid was the one who could mend it. "No, my lord," she said. "I will not." She carried the pitcher away, and her heart was beating in a way she did not care for at all, and she told herself it was only the cold. What she did not yet know was that he had been watching her for a week. Not as a man watches a woman he intends anything by, for he intended nothing, and would have cut off his own hand before he brought scandal on a girl in service. He had been watching her the way a man starved of a thing watches it, in another's house. He had watched how the household ran on her quiet hands, how the frightened daughter steadied when Fenwick was in the room, how the girl said little and saw everything and asked for nothing, and he had felt, for the first time in 10 years, the dangerous and unwelcome stir of a man's heart coming back to life against his will. I will pause here only for a breath. Stay with this story to its end. The promise made at Theowood Court that autumn was kept in the way that mattered, and broken in the way that did not, and the difference between those two things is the whole of what follows. The days went on toward the betrothal. The Dowager Countess of Northmere arrived from the north in a coach and four, with a maid and a man-servant, and a quantity of luggage that suggested she meant to stay until the thing was settled past undoing. Estreld Cardew, the Dowager Countess of Northmere, was 70 that year and looked 60, and had the will of a woman of 30, who has never once been refused. She was small and upright, and dressed always in deep gray silk with white hair dressed high, and a single great pearl at her throat that had come into the family with a marriage 2 centuries before, and had in her mind the weight of a law. She had buried a husband and 2 sons, raised her grandson from a boy, and watched him fold himself away after the death of his girl, and she loved him, in her hard way, more than her own breath, and she had decided, with the certainty of a woman who has decided many things and seen them all come to pass, and that nothing and no one would be permitted to stand in its way. She saw Mercy on the first afternoon. She saw everything. The Dowager. She came down the great stair, leaning on a stick she did not need, and she watched her grandson cross the hall, and she watched the maid passing with an armful of linen, paused to let him by, and she watched him look at the maid, only for an instant, only the smallest turn of the head, and she watched the maid look at the floor. Who had spent 50 years reading the small motions of a room, knew in that instant exactly what was beginning and exactly what it would cost, and she set her jaw and resolved to end it. She did not speak of it to her grandson. One did not. She spoke of it the next morning to the maid alone in the small green sitting room, having sent for her on a pretext of a torn hem. "You mend well," the Dowager said, turning the hem in her thin fingers. She did not look up. "Where were you trained?" "My mother was a seamstress, my lady, in Wexbridge." "Was she?" A pause, the needle of the old woman's attention finding its mark. "You will not have heard in a house like this the things that are said of girls who reach above their station. Let me spare you the hearing of them. They are said in the past tense. Child. A girl who forgets herself is spoken of afterward, when she has already fallen as a thing that was. I have seen it a great many times." She set the hem down. She looked up then, and her pale eyes were not unkind, which was the worst of it. "You seem a sensible creature. A sensible creature knows the difference between a roof and the rain. Do not mistake a great man's loneliness for a door that is open to you. It is not open, and it never will be. The one who tries the latch is the one who is found in the morning, gone, with nothing, and no character to take to her next place. Do you understand me?" "Yes, my lady," Mercy said. Her hands were folded and still. "I understand you very well. Good." The Dowager took up her stick. "Then, we need not speak of it again." They would speak of it again in a public exchange, and then a third time, in a thing reported by a frightened girl, the same charge each time, and the setting only changing, for the Dowager, having decided a person was a danger, would say so until the person agreed to vanish. Mercy did not vanish. She did her work. She dressed Lady Maurice, and sat up with her, and watched the betrothal come on like weather. And in the watching she came to understand a thing that changed the shape of everything, which was that Lady Maurice did not want the marriage any more than the Earl did, and for a reason that had a name, and the name was Mr. Selden. Mr. Selden was the music master, a quiet, brown-haired young man of no fortune and no family worth a duke's notice, who came twice a week to teach the pianoforte, and had been coming for 2 years. And Mercy had seen for a long while how the daughter of the house came alive at the keyboard when he stood beside her, and faded back into her arranged self when he had gone. There was nothing improper in it. He was too honorable and too hopeless to make it so. Real it was all the same, the way the thing between the Earl and the maid was becoming real. And the house was suddenly full of true feeling that the arrangement of 2 great names was about to crush flat. Mercy held all of it, the bride's secret, and the Earl's loneliness, and the music master's hopeless decency and her own foolish heart. The way she held a basket of pins carefully, knowing what a spilled one could do. The first frost came. The betrothal was 3 days off, and the Earl found her in the library. She had not gone there to find him. She had gone to return a volume Lady Maurice had borrowed and forgotten, into the long candlelit room with its bookshelves rising into shadow. And he was there at the far end with a single branch of candles, and he did not send her away. She set the book down and turned to go, and he said, "Her name, not Fenwick. Her name. Mercy." She stopped. No one of his rank had ever said it. It went through her like the first note of something. "Forgive me," he said, and he came toward her down the length of the room, slowly as a man approaches a thing he is afraid will bolt. "I have no right to it. I will not use it again if you forbid me." He stopped a careful distance away. The candlelight moved on the hard planes of his face. "But I find I cannot go on as I am. I am to be married in 3 days to a woman I do not love, and who does not love me, and we will both be wretched, and her father will have his money, and my grandmother will have her settlement. And somewhere in this house there is a girl who has more honesty in the turn of her wrist than the whole of the company that will sit at my wedding breakfast. And I am asking you, before I do this irreversible thing, whether I am a madman or whether you feel it too." The fire settled in the grate. Outside an owl called once across the frozen park. "You must not say such things to me," Mercy said, and her voice was steady, and that steadiness cost her everything she had. "I have no fortune, and no name, and no power in this house, but the power to be turned out of it without a character. If I feel anything, my lord, it changes nothing, except to make me more easily ruined. You may go back to your life when this is done. I cannot. So I will ask you not to say my name again, because it is not kindness. It only sounds like kindness." He was silent a long moment. Something moved in his face, some old grief, meeting some new one. And when he spoke, his voice had gone very low. "You are right," he said. "It is not fair of me. I am sorry." He did not say her name again that night. He did not deny that he had meant it either, and she did not deny that she had felt it. And they stood in the truth of it, for one held breath before she curtsied and left him there with the candles. And both of them understood that something had been spoken aloud that could not now be unspoken, whatever either of them did about it. Mercy lay awake that night and did the only arithmetic she knew. She was a maid, he was an earl. There was no sum in which those two figures came out to anything but her ruin. She resolved, before the candle guttered, to be sensible. She would say nothing. She would do her work. She would let the betrothal happen, and the marriage happen, and mend the bride's gowns and grow old in service, and never once let her face betray what it had cost her, because that was the only road that did not end with her in the rain. She had decided. She was a sensible creature, as the dowager had said. She had reckoned without the bride. For Lady Maurice, it transpired, had her own arithmetic and her own desperation. And on the night before the betrothal, she sent her maid away early, then could not be alone with her fear, and called her back. And in the dark of the great curtained bed, the daughter of the Duke of Theowood wept and confessed everything. The music master and the 2 years of it, and the certainty that she would die a little every day for the rest of her arranged life, and then she said the thing that broke the dam. "He does not want me, either," Lady Maurice whispered. "The Earl, he looks through me as though I were a window. I have seen how he looks at you, Mercy. The whole house has seen it but my father, who sees nothing he does not wish to. Do not tell me I imagine it. I am to be sold to a man who is in love with my own maid. And you are to stand behind my chair at the wedding and lace me into the gown. And we are all 3 of us to pretend forever that this is the order of the world and that it is good." Mercy said nothing. There was nothing in her training that answered it. "I would give my place to you if I could," Lady Maurice said, and she laughed a small broken sound. "Gladly. I want Mr. Black. Selden and a small house and a pianoforte, and I do not care if I am never received anywhere again. And you want him, and he wants you, and not one of us can have what we want because of a settlement and a debt in my grandmother's pearl. Is it not absurd? Is it not perfectly absurd?" And in the dark, slowly, the absurd thing began to take a different shape. Because once a true word is spoken in a house full of arrangements, the arrangements have to move to make room for it. The betrothal was announced. It had to be, for the families had committed too much, and a duke does not unmake a thing before the county without a war. What was announced in the great drawing room, with the candles blazing and the company assembled, the betrothal of the Earl to Lady Marisa Theowood, was already, for all the candles, in the hearts of the two people most concerned, a dead thing. And there were 4 people in that bright room who knew it was dead. And one of them was the Dowager Dame, who knew it best of all, and was watching the Maid. She made her second voicing that night. In the public room, in the polished hierarchy protective sentences she had spent a lifetime perfecting, loud enough for those nearest to hear, and soft enough to be deniable. Mercy had come in with the tray of cordial glasses, threading through the guests and the dowager. Passing, said to the lady beside her, in the carrying murmur of those who wish to be overheard, "One does grow weary of pretty servants who imagine the family does not notice them. There is a kind of girl who mistakes a great house for a stage on which she is the heroine. We had such a one at Northmere. She went to the parish in the end, with her bundle and her heirs, and she let her pale gaze rest on Mercy for one cool, deliberate instant as she said it. And a small laugh went round the nearest ladies, and Mercy set the last glass down without a tremor, and curtsied, and withdrew, and only the whiteness at her knuckles where she gripped the tray said anything at all. That was the peak of it, the public escalation, the dismissive label spoken before the company. So the social cost was made concretely audible. And it was an error, though the dowager did not yet know it was an error, because the Earl had been standing 6 feet away with a glass in his hand, and he had heard every word, and something in his cold, composed face had gone very still and very dangerous, the stillness of ice over a river in the moment before the spring. He did not make a scene. He was not a man who made scenes. He set his glass down and he crossed the room, and he did the one thing in that whole bright assembly that no one was prepared for, which was that he went to the corner where the music master, Mr. Selden, stood unregarded near the instrument, and he spoke to him quietly for the length of 2 minutes, and then he straightened and looked across the room, not at his betrothed and not at his grandmother, but at the door through which the maid had gone. What passed between the Earl and Mr. Selden that night, Mercy did not learn until later. Its consequences began to move through the house like water finding the cracks, and the first crack it found was the Duke's library, 2 mornings on, where the Earl of Northmere asked the Duke of Theowood for a private hour and laid before him a proposal so unexpected that the Duke sat for a full minute in silence with his mouth slightly open. The Earl proposed to release Lady Maurice from the engagement, not to break it in shame, for that would ruin her in the eyes of the county, but to do a more cunning and more merciful thing. He proposed to settle on Lady Maurice as a gift and a kindness for the embarrassment of a withdrawn engagement, a sum sufficient to clear a good portion of the Duke's debts, more than he would have brought as a husband and with none of the strings. In exchange he asked only the Duke's public word that the parting was mutual and amicable, a matter of 2 families reconsidering, so that no breath of disgrace touched the daughter. And he asked one thing more, which he did not explain, and which the Duke, dazzled by the arithmetic, did not think to question, that the Duke not inquire too closely into the Earl's own arrangements thereafter. The Duke, who saw nothing he did not wish to see, and who wished above all to see his debts diminished, agreed. He shook the Earl's hand. He thought himself the cleverest man in the county. He did not know that he had just freed his daughter to marry a music master, and his daughter's maid to marry an earl, and had paid the Earl's price gladly, because the price was dressed as a gentleman's generosity, and the truth of it was hidden where he would never look, which was among the feelings of the women in his house. The dowager was not a man who saw nothing. She was a woman who saw everything, and she saw the shape of it within a day, and she mounted her defense. She did not weep or rage, she acted. First she sent for the family solicitor and confirmed, to her cold satisfaction, that nothing in the settlements compelled her grandson to a particular bride, only to the discharge of the family's restoration, which his gift to the Duke had now accomplished by another road. The law would not stop him. she would stop him by stopping the girl. And so the comb went missing. It was the dowager's own maid, a sour, silent woman named Daw, who had served her 30 years and would have walked into the sea at her word, who lifted the comb from the velvet-lined box in the dark before dawn. And it was the dowager who arranged with the precision of a general the destruction of Mercy Fenwick. The comb was worth £400. The theft of a thing worth above 40 was a hanging matter, or transportation past the world's edge for those the court chose to spare, and a maid with no family and no friend of consequence was the easiest creature in England to send across the sea and never see again. The dowager did not intend the girl should hang. She was not cruel in the way the cheap call cruelty. She intended only that the girl should be charged and frightened past bearing and made to flee in the night before any trial, vanishing into the great anonymous country where ruined servants vanish, and that her grandson should wake to find the maid gone and the gossip already running and understand as men in love do, not otherwise understand, that the thing was hopeless and had always been hopeless, and come back, in time, to his duty and his grandmother's sure hand. It was a good plan. It rested on the certain knowledge that a servant accused has no voice, a certainty the dowager had used her whole life, and which had never once failed her. 2. She had reckoned without the housekeeper, and the steward's book, and 3 years of a quiet girl's quiet honesty, laid down like coins against a day she had never known would come. The charge was made on the morning the betrothal was to have been confirmed before the family. The dowager made it herself in the breakfast room before the Duke and Lady Marisa and the Earl and the assembled upper servants. And she made it in the voice of a woman wounded on the family's behalf, holding the empty lacquered box. The comb, the great pearl and garnet comb that had been Lady Marisa's mother's, was gone, and it had last been seen by Lady Marisa's own woman, who dressed her hair, who had the keys, who sat up alone in the rooms when the house slept, and who, the dowager had it, on the word of her own maid Daw, had been seen at the dressing table in the dead hours with a candle. This was the third voicing of the charge, reported through a trembling intermediary before the master of the house. The girl had been overreaching for weeks. Everyone had seen it. Now they saw what such overreaching came to. She should be taken into the steward's keeping until the magistrate could be sent for. The room went cold and quiet. Lady Maurice made a small sound. The Earl took one step and stopped, because he understood in an instant that anything he said, anything at all, would only confirm the picture the dowager had painted, the great man defending the thieving maid, and would ruin Mercy past saving and Lady Maurice along with her. He stood, his face like carved stone, and could do nothing, and the doing nothing was the worst thing he had done in 10 years. This was the dark moment. This was the lowest point, the all is lost, the path closing. Mercy stood in her plain gray gown with the whole bright machinery of rank, assembled to crush her, accused of a thing that would put her in chains or on a ship. And the one man who would have spoken for her struck dumb by the very fact of his caring, and the dowager upright and certain in her gray silk, with the great pearl at her throat, and not a soul in that room with the power to save her but herself. And Mercy Fenwick, who had spent 3 years saying little and seeing everything, lifted her head and saved herself. She did not weep. She did not protest her innocence, for the innocent protesting are the easiest of all to disbelieve. She said in a voice quiet and clear that did not shake, "I should like the steward's book brought, my lady and Mrs. Sawley, Caraway, the housekeeper, and I should like, if it please his grace, for the lacquered box to be examined, and the comb described aloud before it is found, so that no one may say afterward that I described it to fit what was found." The Duke, startled by the steadiness of her, said it should be done. And then Mercy laid out, plainly, without heat, the record of her own life in that house, every piece of it set down long before this morning, by her own hand, in the ordinary course of an honest woman's work. And that was the whole of her defense, and it was unanswerable. The ledger was brought. In it, in the steward's hand, was the standing instruction Mercy herself had asked for in her first month there 2 years before any of this. that any of the family's jewels passing through her hands for cleaning or repair be set down by the steward and signed, so that a servant in her position should never stand alone against a missing thing. It was an unusual request. The steward had thought so at the time and had written as much. It was the request of a woman who had learned in a hard girlhood exactly how a poor person is destroyed and had built herself a wall against it, stone by quiet stone. The book showed every jewel she had touched in 3 years, set down and signed, and it showed the pearl and garnet comb entered 11 days before, brought for the resetting of a loosened garnet, repaired by Mercy, and signed back into the box by the steward's own hand, on a date the steward, summoned and trembling, confirmed. Then Mrs. Carraway, the housekeeper, was brought, and Mrs. Carraway, a broad, honest woman who had run the lower house for 20 years, and had no love for the cold northern dowager who had been ordering her servants about for a fortnight, said under the Duke's questioning that the keys to the rooms hung in the housekeeper's room at night, not with Fenwick, and that on the night in question they had hung there untouched, for Mrs. Carraway slept across the passage, was a light sleeper, and would have heard the door, and that the only stranger's servant seen below stairs in the dead hours that week was the dowager's own woman, Daw, whom she had found 2 nights running, where she had no business being, near the back stair that led up to the family rooms. The room turned. One could feel it turn. The Duke's face, which saw nothing it did not wish to see, was being made to see. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the housekeeper. He looked at the dowager, and for the first time, something cold moved behind his ducal complacency. The dowager did not yield, for she had built her defense as carefully as Mercy had built hers, and she had 1 card left. She said, smooth as gray silk, that a book might be falsified and a housekeeper might lie for one of her own, and that the comb itself was still missing, and a missing thing was a missing thing, and until it was found the charge stood, and she would send for the magistrate herself if his grace had grown too soft to do it. And here the thing turned on the one piece. The dowager could not have foreseen, because it was a piece Mercy had made for herself, quietly, the way she made everything. "The comb is not gone from the room, my lady," Mercy said. "The proof of it is where it was put. May I?" She crossed to the lacquered box which the dowager held, and she did not take it, but pointed, and asked the Duke to have the box examined by his own hand and no one else's, and when the Duke turned the box over he found, beneath the lining, a thing Daw had not known to look for. Because Mercy had built it the same week, she repaired the comb, and told no one. That box had a false floor, a shallow second compartment Mercy had fitted. Under the velvet, a maid's old trick for the keeping of small precious things in a house where things go astray. And folded flat in that compartment, exactly where her own hands had laid it 11 days before, was a slip of paper in the steward's hand, signed and dated, recording the return of the comb to the box, and pressed beneath it, caught by the fitted velvet so that a quick hand reaching in the dark had lifted the obvious thing and missed the hidden one, was a single garnet, the very stone she had reset, fallen loose again and dropped by the hand that snatched the comb. The comb was gone with Daw, the stone it could not be without, and the paper that proved the comb hers to keep in return were in the false floor where she had built them to be safe. It was not luck. That was the thing the room understood, slowly watching the Duke turn the loose garnet in his fingers. It was not luck, and it was not rescue. The girl had been building her own defense for 2 years, in the steward's book and the false floor and the signed slips of paper. Not because she knew this morning was coming, but because she knew that for a woman like her, some morning always came. And she had refused, with all her stubborn strength. The dowager had brought every weapon rank could muster against a servant, and the servant had quietly, years before, made herself a thing that rank could not break, which was a true and witnessed and dated account of her own honest life. The dowager looked at the garnet in the Duke's hand, and the signed slip, and the steward's ledger and the housekeeper's plain face, and she understood that she had lost, and more than that she had been beaten not by her grandson's rank, nor by luck, nor by some sentimental accident, but by the girl herself. by a quality her whole life and categories had no measure for, the quality of a person who is exactly what she appears to be, all the way down, and has built her life out of that and nothing else. And the dowager who had not been wrong about a person in 50 years sat down slowly in the chair the footman brought, and the pearl rose and fell at her throat, and she said, in a voice gone suddenly old, "Send Daw to me." That was as near to a surrender as a woman of her make could come, and everyone in the room knew it for what it was. The Earl crossed the room then. He did it without haste and without drama, in the calm that comes to some men, only on the far side of fear, and he came to where Mercy stood by the dressing table, with the loose garnet's shape still pressed into the air between them. And he did not take her hand, for there were eyes everywhere, and he would not so cheapen her. But he turned to the Duke and the company and his grandmother, and he said the thing he had come 3 weeks and 10 years and a whole frozen life to say. And he said it once, and it was specific and irrevocable, and could not be unsaid. "Miss Fenwick will be my wife. No one will speak against her." It fell into the silence the way a true thing falls. With weight, Lady Maurice made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. The Duke's mouth opened and shut. And the dowager, who had come south to save her grandson from himself, looked at the maid who had just unmade 3 years of her certainties in the space of a quarter hour, and at her grandson's face, which had come alive in a way she had not seen since before the girl he loved had died. And something in the old woman's iron, softened by exactly the smallest degree the truth required, no more, and she said nothing at all, which from her was everything. They were married quietly 3 weeks later, not in disgrace and not in defiance, but in the plain decency the Earl had bought for everyone with his cunning and his money, and his quiet, stubborn love. Tad. The county was told that the engagement had been ended by mutual kindness between the families, and that the Earl, a widower of grief in all but the marriage that had never quite happened, had after a time formed an attachment of his own. The particulars were left vague, as the particulars of the great always are. And the gift the Earl had settled on the Duke kept every tongue soft and grateful. Lady Maurice married her music master, in the spring, in a small church with a borrowed gown that Mercy made over with her own clever hands, so that the daughter of a duke went to her hopeless love looking like a queen. And the Duke, who had got his debts cleared and a story he could tell at his club, decided in the end to be charmed by all of it. For it is wonderful how charming a man can find a thing once it has stopped costing him money. The running off that the county half whispered of and never quite confirmed, the elopement that was supposed to have been a scandal, was no theft of another woman's man and no shame to anyone, but the quiet, honorable joining of two people who had each refused, in their own way, to live a lie. The maid who would not reach above her station for a roof, and the Earl who would not marry where there was no truth, brought together not by intrigue, but by the one thing the whole bright machinery of rank could neither make nor break, which was the plain fact of what each of them was. The dowager came to the wedding. She came in deep gray silk, with the pearl at her throat, and she sat very upright, and afterward she sent for the new Countess of Northmere. Alone in the small green sitting room where she had once threatened her with the parish and the rain, Mercy went and stood, with her hands folded as she had stood the first time, and waited. "You fitted a false floor in a lady's jewel box," the dowager said, turning her own rings on her thin fingers. 2 years before you had any cause. You had every stone you touched set down in a book. You taught a steward to sign for you. You armed yourself, child, against a morning you could not have known would come, against an enemy you had not yet met. I have commanded armies of servants for 50 years, and never once met one I could not break, and I have just watched you break me with a paper and a stone you laid by when my grandson was still refusing every match I brought him. She looked up, and her pale eyes were clear and hard, and at last, not unkind in pretense, but in fact. I was wrong about you. I am not often wrong. I find I do not entirely dislike the sensation. You will do better by him than the Duke's daughter would have done, because you are not afraid of anything, and he has been afraid for 10 years. And a man like that needs a wife with no fear, in her at all. She held out her thin hand, and on the palm of it lay the great pearl and garnet comb, recovered from where Daw had hidden it, the loose garnet reset, by Mercy's own asking, in its proper place. Lady Marisa will not want it now. Her mother's comb. It should go to the woman who saved this family the trouble of a mistake. Take it, and do not, I beg you, fit false floors in my house. I am too old to be outwitted in my own home. Mercy took the comb. She understood that it was an apology and a surrender and a kind of love, all dressed as a gift, because that was the only way a woman of the dowager's make could give any of those things. Thank you, my lady, she said. I shall keep it where it can be found. And the dowager, after a startled instant, laughed a short dry sound, like a door long shut coming open. The first such anyone at Theawood Court had heard from her, and the thing between the two women was settled, not in triumph and not in defeat, but in the quiet correction of an old certainty by a new truth. That night, the first night of her married life, the new mistress of the house sat by the fire, in a room that was hers, in a house that was hers, with a husband who had crossed a crowded room before the whole machinery of his world to claim her by name, and she was mending. Old habit. She had a torn flounce of Lady Marie's that had come with her. Things by accident and would be sent on in the morning, and she sat with the needle going in and out by the firelight as it had through 3 years of cold, late nights when she had no name and no roof. She could call her own, and she was not afraid. The Earl came and stood behind her chair and watched her hands. He had watched those hands across a whole autumn, when watching was all he had allowed himself. He reached down and stilled them gently. The needle caught mid-stitch, and she let him, and turned her face up to his in the firelight. The freckles she had never been able to fade, and the hazel eyes that gave nothing away to anyone but him now. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, because everything that needed saying had been said before the company, and could not be unsaid. You may say my name now, she told him. Mercy, he said. The fire settled. Outside, the first snow of the year had begun to fall across the dark park, soft and without sound, covering the long drive he had ridden up that gray afternoon when he had looked at her house the way a man looks at a debt, and she set the needle down at last, the flounce half-mended on her knee, and did not take it up again. For there was nothing left in that house that needed mending, and had not been, she understood now, for some little while. If Mercy's quiet courage stayed with you, stay a moment longer in the warmth of that room before you go. And remember her, the girl with the clever hands who would not reach above her station, and so was lifted past it, and the cold man who came alive, and the old woman by the snow-lit window who learned, at 70, that she had been wrong, and was not too proud in the end to be glad of it.